I was 19 when I lay on that cold stretcher with a gown strapped to my back and an IV stuck in my arm, hoping to save my older brother Daniel's life. Everyone said he was the pride of the family, the golden boy. I was just the backup, the obedient daughter who couldn't be bothered. My right kidney was living proof of that. At the time, the doctor said I was the only one compatible. I didn't even hesitate. My mother cried. My father remained silent. Daniel, lying on the bed next to me, just squeezed my hand tightly. "I'll make it up to you one day," he said. I thought it was beautiful, naive, like a graduation song. The surgery was long, painful. It took me months to really recover, but no one at home seemed to notice. Daniel did. He got better every week, gaining weight, color, spirit. I went back to college with medication in my bag and a scar on my side that I'll never forget. The following years passed in automatic mode. While he traveled for courses and jobs abroad, I stayed there, rotating between ordinary jobs and bills to pay. Daniel became a successful businessman, or so he said at family lunches, which were always paid for by my parents. I, on the other hand, started working as a store manager in the city's shopping mall, far from the magazine covers and proud clapping. Deep down, it didn't bother me that much. I believed in that old illusion that blood weighs, that what you do with your heart comes back, that Daniel was still, somehow, the skinny boy who held my hand before the surgery. I kept pushing this faith until I was in my 30s, until I started to see the cracks. The first time I suspected something was wrong was on a Saturday morning. My mother called me in a hurry saying that Daniel was organizing a restructuring of the family's assets and wanted my signature on a document. She said it was silly bureaucracy, just to regularize a few things. They didn't explain what it was. They didn't even insist. I thought it was strange, but I had just lost my job and my head was a mess. I asked to see the document, of course. The answer was silence, and then, "Don't worry, we'll sort it out later." The later never came. I found a way to get on with my life. I got a new job, even smaller, in a beauty clinic. I lived in an old apartment that had more leaks than solid walls. And Daniel? He bought a new house, not a normal house. A mansion outside the city with an infinity pool, a glass balcony, and cars lined up in the garage like soldiers ready for war. I've never been invited to visit, not once. At Christmas that year, my mother had the nerve to ask me if I could help with the children's presents, Daniel's kids. I stared at the makeshift tree in the living room of my studio apartment, decorated with flashing lights in 3 colors because that's what you could buy in the corner shop. I helped, of course, because a good daughter helps. The weather beat down on me like a fine rain that you don't even feel properly until you realize you're already soaked. The next thing I knew, I hadn't had a decent family dinner in over 2 years. The gatherings took place, yes, but always in Daniel's parallel world. Expensive buffets, giant toys for the nephews, abundant tables where the name "thank you" seemed to have been erased from the vocabulary. And then, as always happens with those who insist on ignoring their own intuition, the strongest blow came. I received a letter from the bank. No, it wasn't an advertisement, it was a debt notification. A loan had been approved in my name, which I'd never applied for, with installments due and legal collection imminent. My name, my forged signature, and the address? The address was the little mansion where Daniel lived. It took me hours to process what that meant. I went to my parents' house the next day, the paper still crumpled in my sweaty hand. My mother, pale, said it must have been a mistake by the accountant. My father didn't even look me in the eye. And Daniel? Daniel didn't show up. He was, according to them, too busy traveling on business. It was the first time that the scar on my belly throbbed as if to scream, "You gave a piece of your body to someone who didn't hesitate to steal the rest." I went into a silent war from then on. I spent months trying to clear my name, gathering evidence, hunting for cheap lawyers, holding despair in my chest. And the most absurd thing was hearing my mother asking me not to expose the family, not to make a fuss, as if I was the one who had destroyed my life and not her golden son. I began to realize that the kidney story wasn't a heroic family act. It was just another invisible bargaining chip, like the many that circulated behind the backs of those who were always considered the least trouble. I should have realized it on that cold morning of the surgery when no one asked me if I was afraid, only if I was strong enough. Now I knew the answer, and the naked truth was that I was alone. No hero, no debt of gratitude, nothing. Or rather, I did have something. I had a debt to my name, a forgotten scar, and a growing rage that I didn't even know I was capable of feeling. The only thing that still kept me from exploding was the feeling that Daniel, however far away he was now, was still going to cross my path. After that letter from the bank, something inside me died. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was silent, like water cooling in a forgotten kettle. I went to work every day, smiled at the clinic's clients, listened to their complaints about cellulite and brittle hair, while inside I mentally sketched out all the possible ways to settle the score with my brother. I didn't have the courage to confront him directly, partly out of fear, partly because there was still a small, pathetic hope that it was all a misunderstanding. So I started to observe. I logged on to the social networks he fed so much, with photos of barbecues, trips to expensive destinations, wine dinners that cost more than my entire salary. A man who never mentioned that the reason he was still breathing was because of the piece of me he carried inside his body. The months passed, and the bank debt dragged on like a chain around my ankle. I tried to renegotiate. I tried to explain that it was fraud. To no avail. In a system where paper is worth more than words, the forged signature had more power than any piece of my story. In the midst of this chaos, my health began to fail. The appointments I avoided, the tests I put off, they all took their toll. The doctor looked at me with the rehearsed face of someone who has seen too much misfortune to be moved. He said that my remaining kidney was starting to overload. I needed to change my life urgently. Change. What a funny word. I couldn't change anything. I didn't have the money to move out of the moldy apartment. I couldn't quit my job. I didn't even have anyone to turn to. My parents? They were still locked in a theater of denial so grotesque, it was pathetic. My mother talked about Daniel as if he were an untouchable star. My father just shook his head, as if it was all just a bad phase. One Sunday I received a message from him, dry director, "Come by the house, I want to show you something." He didn't say where it was, he didn't ask if I could. He didn't offer a ride, nothing, just an order, like calling the maid to clean the floor. And I, in my chronic stupidity, went. I took a crowded bus, walked for almost 40 minutes under a sun that seemed to want to tear my skin off until I reached the gated community where he lived. The security guard didn't even look at me properly. He seemed to already know me from not very flattering stories. The house was even bigger than in the photos, a fortress of glass and concrete, as cold as the intentions of those who built it. Daniel greeted me at the door with a plastic smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Come in," he said, like someone talking to an inconvenient neighbor. The room looked like a showroom, no trace of real life, no messy children, no family photos, just expensive furniture and modern works of art that looked more like insults than decoration. He led me out onto the balcony, where 2 glasses of wine had already been poured. I found that strange. Daniel was never one for gratuitous gestures. There was always a purpose behind any treat. I sat down, but I didn't drink. He started talking about investments, about deals he was closing, about opportunities that might interest me. He talked about high figures, figures that sounded like something out of a bad movie. And there I was with my sweaty hands in my lap, waiting for the knife that I knew would come. When he finally stopped showing off, he handed me a folder. "I'd like you to sign some documents," he said casually, as if asking me to pass the salt. I opened the folder. It was a contract for the transfer of inheritance rights. In short, I was giving up any share of future assets in the name of facilitating the family's financial processes. Translation, giving up everything I owned, which, let's face it, wasn't much, so that he could sell, mortgage, do whatever he wanted without having to consult me. I closed the folder slowly and looked at him. Daniel smiled, a small, lazy smile, sure that I, the same old idiot, would accept. He said it was just a formality, that in practice, nothing would change. In practice, always the practice of seeing him, appropriate what I never had the chance to dispute, the practice of being forgotten until it's useful, the practice of being used. For the first time in my life, I took a deep breath and said no. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just shoved the folder back at him and stood up, without making a scene, without giving a speech, without giving him the pleasure of my pain. Daniel was paralyzed for 2 seconds, as if his internal operating system had crashed. Then he laughed, a short, incredulous laugh, as if I were a tantruming child denied a sweet. "Think about it," he said, still smiling. This is for your own good. I left the house feeling the hot asphalt burn the soles of my cheap sneakers. I didn't look back. For weeks after that, the silence was absolute. No phone calls, no messages, just the echo of the decision I knew I had signed with my own blood. I was no longer useful, and when you stop being useful to those who only see you as a tool, you become a target. The first real threat came in disguise, an invitation to family dinner, a rare, almost extinct thing. My mother excited, my father quieter than usual. The table was full, Daniel serving plates, laughing too loudly. My glass of juice separated from the rest. I accepted the drink, out of reflex, but something stopped me before I touched my lips. A strange smell, a slight bitterness in the air. I pretended to drink. I put the glass to my mouth and let the liquid flow back out when everyone was distracted. No one noticed. I ate just enough not to arouse suspicion. I smiled just enough not to attract any stares. And I left with the uncomfortable certainty that something was afoot. Daniel watched me leave, not with anger, not with contempt. He watched like someone watching a countdown clock. That night, lying on the hard bed in my apartment, I realized that the game had changed. It was no longer about money. It was about elimination, and I was finally awake. The next morning, the sun had no right to rise so strongly like that, but it did mercilessly. I opened the window, and the raw light flooded into the apartment without asking permission, highlighting the peeling walls, the piles of bills on the kitchen counter, and the reality that I was trying to keep organized with duct tape and patience. I couldn't get out of my head the metallic taste I felt just smelling that juice. It was as if my own body had refused it, like some ancient primitive instinct that you forget to listen to until the day you need it, so you don't die. I spent the day moving around like a ghost, pretending to be normal while my mind raced. At work, the clients' voices sounded distant, as if I were immersed in an aquarium and everything around me was noise. I signed papers without paying attention, served coffees without remembering who was who, gave automatic smiles that were more like spasms. I felt small, vulnerable, exposed, as if I were carrying an invisible target on my back. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to stitch together the sequence of the last few months. Every detail I had ignored now fitted together like pieces of a sinister puzzle. My mother's increasingly worried, almost suffocating phone calls, the attempts to involve me in family business, Daniel's strange insistence on making me sign documents that I barely understood, and now a dinner that could well have been my last meal. What scared me most wasn't even the possibility of dying. It was realizing how easy it was to erase me without arousing suspicion. I had been invisible for so long that my absence would only be noticed by late bills and gossipy neighbors commenting that the girl from 302 had disappeared. I didn't answer calls for days. I didn't answer any messages. I created false routines, changed my routes home, avoided places I used to go. Not that Daniel was going to follow me down the street, of course. He was the type who did things cleanly, discreetly, who hid behind plausible excuses. A sudden illness, food poisoning, an unfortunate fall. That's how I was going to disappear, in a footnote with no questions asked. In the midst of this period of silent paranoia, I began to gather evidence. It was pathetic, but it was all I could do. Photos of old documents, prints of messages, bank records, any trace that could prove there was something wrong if everything went wrong. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. All I knew was that I needed to leave signs for someone to find later. One afternoon, while I was organizing these little pieces of evidence on my old laptop, I received a notification. It was an update to Daniel's profile, photos of a new development, another $1 million investment advertised as a family business. Family. The word hit me like a punch. I felt an irrational urge to comment, to put it all out there for everyone to see. But I stopped myself. Daniel knew how to play. I didn't. In a direct confrontation, I'd be crushed like an ant crossing the wrong street. I decided to do something better. I made a doctor's appointment, a full checkup. I wanted an up-to-date report on my health. I wanted proof that, if I died suddenly, my remaining kidney was working, my body was in normal condition, my life wasn't a ticking time bomb about to explode on its own. I left the clinic with the tests in hand and a strange feeling that I was writing my own will. That same week, I found a lawyer. I couldn't afford big fees, but she agreed to see me for a simple consultation. I explained the situation in general terms, omitting the heavy details so as not to sound like a conspiracy nut. She listened to everything with the neutral expression of someone who has seen enough tragedies not to be shaken. Then she took a deep breath and said, almost in a whisper, "You need to protect yourself, formally." He advised me to register a will, make it clear who my beneficiaries would be, protect my few assets, tell trusted friends about the situation. It was ridiculous. I had almost nothing: a rented apartment, an empty bank account, an old cell phone, but now it all seemed worth more than life itself. I had everything organized: a sealed envelope with basic instructions. I handed it to my best friend without going into too much detail. She looked at me suspiciously, but accepted. We've never been ones for long explanations. True friendship is made up of those heavy silences that sometimes save lives. The following days were tense calm, like the heavy air before a storm. There were no more dinner invitations, no explicit attempts at contact. Daniel disappeared from the radar like a predator that retreats to strike when the time is right. Until one Saturday morning, while I was making the bed, I received an unexpected message, an invitation to a birthday celebration. Guess who? His. A big event with family and friends in a remote place, one of those places where the cell phone signal barely picks up and no one hears screams in the middle of the woods. I was absolutely certain that I wasn't really invited. I was part of the menu. I sat on the edge of the bed again, cell phone in hand, feeling my throat dry up. I knew that if I didn't go, it would arouse suspicion. If I went, I might not come back. I spent hours thinking about what to do. Run away? Cut all ties? Report it? The police would laugh at me. I was just a bitter woman accusing her own family without proof, and Daniel knew it. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. At the end of the afternoon, I replied to the message with a "sure I will," followed by a smiley face emoji. The game wasn't over yet. If he wanted to finish me off, he'd have to try one more time. But this time, I wouldn't go alone. This time, I would have eyes watching, evidence stored, traces planted. I wouldn't be easy to erase. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt a warm spark rise in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to ancient anger, the hunger for justice that only those who have been discarded like garbage can understand. The place was far enough away to make any kind of help seem like a fantasy. I took a bus to the nearest terminal and then an Uber, my cell phone almost dead. The dirt road looked like something out of a bad movie, with potholes that rattled the car as if fate wanted to remind me all the time that it was a bad idea to be there. I arrived in the early afternoon. The heat seemed to boil the air and made the trees shake like mirages. The property was gigantic, surrounded by a simple wire fence, almost symbolic. The main house was large, made of dark wood, with a veranda that creaked under the weight of some guests who were already drinking beer and talking loudly. It looked like an improvised set to hide what was really going to happen there. I was greeted with forced hugs and occasional smiles. Daniel showed up a few minutes later, immaculate, wearing a white shirt that seemed even more irritating in that dusty setting. He greeted me as if nothing was out of place, as if the last few months of silence, betrayals, and threats had never happened. I pretended the same. It was the game I now knew how to play. The party went by in slow motion. People I hardly knew, distant relatives, some faces I vaguely recognized from other family gatherings where I was always forgotten in the corner of the room. Everyone seemed relaxed, but there was an invisible tension in the air, a strange kind of euphoria, as if something big was about to happen. I was discreet, observing every detail. I saw Daniel talking to a man I'd never seen before, tall, with tattooed arms, gesticulating too much. I saw my mother laughing loudly, exaggeratedly, as if trying to erase any discomfort. I saw my father drinking faster than usual, small cracks in the perfect staging. When the food was served, I was sure that this was where everything would unfold. The plates came ready from the kitchen, brought by two women who looked as uncomfortable as I did. I saw from a distance when Daniel exchanged a quick word with one of them, who immediately looked in my direction. I didn't smile back. When they put my plate on the table, I stared at it for a few seconds. It looked normal: meat, rice, vegetables, unpretentious family party food. Even so, I felt the same shiver I had felt that night at dinner at home. I took the plate to the bathroom at the back of the house. pretending to be on my cell phone, and threw the food in the trash. Nobody saw. Or if they did, they pretended not to. It was what everyone there did best. I returned to the table with an empty plate and an empty smile. A few minutes later, I saw Daniel watching me from afar. He didn't smile, he didn't toast. He just watched me as if timing something. The hours dragged by like wet sand. As the sun began to descend over the horizon, everyone was called up for a surprise tribute. Daniel, ever the master of ceremonies, asked everyone to gather on the balcony. He got up on a small makeshift stage and began to talk about family, about achievements, about the importance of blood ties. My parents, sitting in the front row, seemed mesmerized. The children ran around, indifferent to the adult tension that dominated the room. I stayed behind, near the fence, where the tall bushes offered some shade and a possible escape route if something got out of hand. In the middle of the speech, Daniel announced that he wanted to do something symbolic, something that would celebrate the union between the family members. He called me specifically to the center of the stage. The world seemed to shrink around me. I walked up the wooden steps with calculated steps, feeling the gaze of dozens of people on my back. Daniel smiled a stage smile and took a small black box out of his pocket. Inside was a simple gold chain with a drop-shaped pendant. He said it was to symbolize the sacrifice I had made years ago, and that he finally wanted to acknowledge it publicly. The applause was lukewarm, almost embarrassed. He put the chain around my neck and tightened the clasp. It felt like being marked, not honored. The cold metal on my skin felt like it was burning. I thanked him with a nod, not trusting my own voice. I got off the stage as quickly as I could and slipped back into the shadows. In the confusion that followed, I took the opportunity to escape to the bathroom. I closed the door and locked the handle. I looked in the mirror. I didn't recognize the face that stared back at me. I slowly took off the pendant and examined it. It was heavier than it should have been. I tried to open the clasp, but it seemed to have been welded shut. On an impulse, I put the chain aside and carefully pressed the pendant against the marble countertop in the bathroom. A small lid came off. Inside was a tiny transparent capsule filled with a reddish liquid. I stood there for what seemed like an eternity. The hum of the world outside seemed distant, muffled. My stomach turned. Daniel had prepared everything. Not the dish, it wasn't the juice, it was this. It was the gift. A jewel that could slowly poison through contact with the skin or that could be accidentally ingested if broken. When I left the bathroom, every step echoed like thunder. I didn't go back to the party. I made my way through the tall bushes, scratching myself on the dry branches until I reached the road. I took out my cell phone, which was still low on battery, and called my friend. I asked her to activate the plan. She knew what to do. I didn't look back. The report had been made anonymously. Drugs in the drink, suspicion of attempted murder, enough to get the police knocking on the door of the place hours later. Daniel would be called to testify, and this time, he wouldn't be able to turn the truth into another one of his platitudinous speeches. When I got home late at night, my ankles swollen and my body covered in scratches, I threw the poisonous chain into a box, sealed it with adhesive tape, and put it in the back of the cupboard. A reminder that no matter how deep someone digs to bury you, there's always a chance to dig back. I hadn't won yet, I wasn't safe yet, but for the first time, I was no longer the prey running in the dark. I was the wrong target. The next few days dragged on like an endless winter. I would wake up startled, my chest tight as if I was short of air, and it would take me a while to remember that I was still alive, that there was still time, that it wasn't the end yet. The anonymous tip-off had had an immediate effect. Not that Daniel had been arrested. He was too clever to leave obvious traces. But the discreet police visits to his house had started to become routine. The mask of the perfect son was starting to crack around the edges, even if, to those who really wanted to believe, it still seemed intact. My parents called a few times, long, worried messages, asking where I was, why I'd left the party so early, if everything was all right. I didn't ask what they knew or if they really wanted to know. I just turned off my cell phone and left the world outside my door, trying to build some kind of fortress inside what little I still had left. The weeks turned into months. Daniel disappeared from social media. He canceled public appearances. He gave up on some of the businesses he had been promoting so enthusiastically. Something in his silence was more revealing than any direct attack. He knew that I was no longer the easy pawn to sacrifice. He knew that I was no longer willing to die in silence so that he could go on living as if nothing had happened. In the meantime, I rebuilt my life as best I could. I moved to a new apartment, a small, simple place, but where every wall seemed to breathe with me. I got a new job in another city, a few hours away, where no one knew my surname or the dirty stories it carried. Starting from scratch wasn't as scary as it sounded. What was worse was having stood still for all those years, waiting for recognition from people who only knew how to measure love in terms of usefulness. As the days went by, the scar on my belly, which had always been a reminder of my blind loyalty, began to hurt less, not because it had disappeared, but because I learned to look at it as a silent medal, proof that even though I had been made a fool of, I still carried within me something that Daniel would never have, the ability to honor promises without expecting a return. I never knew exactly what the investigation found. They never called me to testify. Perhaps the evidence I left planted scared him enough to back down. Maybe the authorities preferred to shelve the case to avoid headaches. It didn't matter. The important thing was that, for the first time, Daniel was afraid of me. The last contact we had was months later, one afternoon, in the form of a letter. A white sheet of paper, folded carelessly, left in my old mailbox. No envelope, no signature, but I knew it was from him. The text was short, a disguised apology. He said that things had gotten out of hand, that he never really wanted to hurt me, that it had all been a misunderstanding, exaggerations of difficult circumstances. He asked me to forget the past, to move on, to be a family again. I read the letter once, then again, and again, not because I believed a word of it, but because I was trying to understand what kind of man could put so many empty excuses, so many manipulative tricks, so much cowardice disguised as regret into so few lines. I didn't answer, I didn't call, I didn't look. I simply kept the letter in the same box as the poisonous chain, like two sad trophies from a war that, even without gunshots, left scars deeper than any open wound. Returning to normal life took time. My trust in people, which was already fragile, crumbled. I became suspicious of kind gestures, easy promises, and hugs that were too warm. But little by little, loneliness stopped being a punishment and became protection. I discovered that silence could be comforting. That peace didn't have to be noisy to be real. Sometimes I wondered if he still thought about me, if he remembered, as he laid his head on the expensive pillow in the house he probably still kept, that there was a sister somewhere, breathing freely, out of his reach. It didn't matter. True freedom, I discovered, doesn't come when someone apologizes or acknowledges you. It comes when you understand that you no longer need that to live. One evening, many months later, I walked to the park near my house. The wind was cold, biting, but the feeling of standing there, whole, without invisible debts weighing on my back, was warmer than any blanket. I stopped in front of a small lake, the black water reflecting the yellowish lights of the street lamps. I took the chain out of my pocket. The metal still felt icy, as if it carried within it all the poison it had never managed to pour into me. Without ceremony, I threw the pendant into the water. The sound was small, almost imperceptible, but inside me it was like the crash of thunder. I made no requests. I didn't say thank you. I didn't cry. I just turned my back and walked away. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some relationships don't heal. Some betrayals don't fade with time. And that's okay, because at the end of the day, survival isn't about defeating the enemy. It's about not letting them change who you are. And if you agree with me and you've made it this far, leave your opinion in the comments and your like below.